Okay, so to begin, we should define what is a critique. So the way that I like to think about it is that where most disadvantages are arguments about the consequences of implementing the plan, critiques are arguments about the consequences of using the assumptions or ideology behind or justifications for the plan. So rather than just looking at the material consequences of what happens if we implement this particular idea, we look at what sort of reasons are being provided to do that idea, what sort of assumptions are built into those justifications, what sort of ideology exists behind those justifications, and what are the consequences of that. So the parts of a critique kind of initially break down similarly to most disadvantages. So first, you need a link. Oftentimes people take this a little bit too much for granted, but you do need to demonstrate how the 1AC relies on, promotes, or uses the sort of ideology or assumptions in question. So, how does 1AC rely on X assumption? Second part is an impact. Occasionally, you'll see the word implication used instead of impact, but it's the same thing. People just like to be pretentious when they're talking about critique, so they use different words. And this, again, is very analogous to disadvantages. Just what is the consequence of using that ideology or those assumptions? Where it starts to get trickier is what happens after this. The next kind of major part of any critique is the alternative. Some people like to compare the alternative to a counterplan. The idea being that most critiques don't really have a strong claim to uniqueness in the way that you would think about it like a disadvantage. If you read a capitalism critique, for example, and you're like, the 1AC is sort of trapped in a capitalist ideology, it uses a bunch of capitalist assumptions. In terms of uniqueness, the AF can very easily say, like, hey, the status quo is already capitalist, everything is already capitalist now, why is that something that's unique to the plan? And so instead of kind of having to win that there's just like a linear, the plan causes capitalism disadvantage, which doesn't make sense, the negative instead wants to have an alternative. And sometimes that alternative is advocating some sort of material action, some sort of civil disobedience, organization against capitalism, something like that. More often, it's advocating a change kind of in individual mindsets, how we think about the issue, or some combination of those two. So some combination of advocating an action with advocating a change in how we think, right? And that's kind of your attempt to generate, uniqueness in this sense. You're like, all right, you're right, capitalism exists now, the AF is embroiled in that. Rather than just saying, all right, it's inevitable, we should think, how can we get out of that? What is the alternative to capitalism? Is there a different way of thinking about or relating to the world that is more productive than that? The final part, well, I guess I should define them. So an alternative then, I'm using the word to define itself, so that's silly, but what is the alternative to given ideology? How do we get there? The final part, and often kind of the most important part, is framework. A framework argument is important because otherwise it can often kind of seem like the alternative and the plan are just kind of like two ships passing in the night. They're two very different things. On one side, you have someone being like, we should have the United States federal government pass legislation to restrict the NSA. And on the other side, you have people being like, we as individuals should challenge the way that we think about capitalism and create alternative ways of relating to the world. And one of those things has an agent that is us as individuals and how we think. One of them has an agent that is this large institutional bureaucracy that we call our government. And so they're very different. And so we kind of need framework questions to raise the issue of how we should evaluate or from what perspective we should evaluate the debate. So most 1ACs sort of take a given framework for granted. And the default framework that most debates tend to have, if no one says anything about it, is that the framework of debate is a policymaking framework. That the purpose of debate should be to vote for the best government policy. But there's plenty of different alternative frameworks or different ways of evaluating the debate. So we could instead say, for example, that we should vote for the team that endorses the best way of relating to or thinking about the world, instead of the team that advocates the best, specific policy action. As a result, a lot of critical framework arguments tend to shift the focus of debate onto individuals as opposed to institutions, to ask what we can do, how we as individuals contribute to sort of larger structures and ideologies. But that needn't always be the case. There are certainly other examples of different frameworks or different perspectives for evaluating the debate that don't necessarily exclude looking at policies. So one sort of common example that you'll hear that is somewhat critical related, but isn't necessarily something that always happens with a critique, is if someone talks about deontology, or using sort of a priori ethics instead of consequentialism as a way of deciding what is the best action. So we generally tend to default to like a utilitarian calculus of like what is the greatest good for the greatest number, but you could propose that instead we should have sort of some default moral principles that guide our actions, and that would be a different way of evaluating the debate. So there's a lot of different ways that you could say we should evaluate the debate outside of a normal policymaking framework. What tends to generally happen, though, in critique debates about framework is that the affirmative will start out and say the debate should just be about policymaking. We should just talk about what is the best policy action. The negative will come with something else, say no, we should think about how we as individuals contribute to different ideologies or producing certain forms of knowledge. The affirmative will generally complain, or will not complain, complaints makes it seem bad, but affirmative framework arguments usually relate around fairness. Generally, right? So we're kind of like, hey, the resolution asked us the United States federal government should do X. We had to read this plan about whether or not the United States federal government should do X. We spent this whole 1AC, spent like 8 minutes of time talking about what the United States federal government should do. If suddenly the whole debate is no longer about federal government policymaking and is just about us as individuals, that whole 1AC goes away. That's kind of unfair. It's an unfair position to put the affirmative in. But on the flip side, most negative framework arguments relate more around education. So if any of you all are familiar to some extent with theory debates, those generally kind of are the two major impacts that come up in any theory debate. Is something fair for debate? Does something make debate more educational? So the neg often has pretty strong arguments that are like, look, if we have a view of the world that sort of myopically or exclusively focuses on just government policy without ever considering sort of other viewpoints, considering how we as individuals promote certain assumptions and stuff like that, that's a very narrow or limited way of thinking about the world. That your sort of educational scope of debate is much narrower if we focus only on government policy. So framework debates usually consist of sort of arguments back and forth about sort of what's more important, preserving fairness for the affirmative or sort of broadening the educational horizons of debate. But what often happens is you just end up with a compromise, which is kind of the middle ground. So there's no reason that you couldn't have a framework that says we should evaluate both the consequences of implementing the plan and the consequences of using the assumptions behind the plan or the justifications for the plan. So often framework debates tend to sort of, progress into a compromise or progress into a middle ground. It doesn't always have to be that way. If you're negative and you can win a framework argument that we should ignore federal government policymaking and focus only on something else, that's a very powerful argument for precisely the inverse reason of the affirmative fairness claims. That takes away a lot of what the app was trying to do. That's very strategic. On the flip side, if the app could win a very strong framework argument that we should ignore everything other than policymaking, then the whole critique kind of goes away. So those are powerful options, but most people don't like to kind of go so far to one extreme that these debates often just kind of end up in the middle ground and we end up evaluating both. and you have to kind of compare them against each other. There's some benefits to doing the plan, but there's some problems for the way you advocated the plan, and you have to kind of compare. So with that outline in mind, kind of want to go over a few different types of critiques, categories of critiques. And there's like some overlap between these, but these are just kind of rough categories that I think of as kind of helpful groupings. So let me clear some space over here. Wow, this doesn't erase very well. So the first set of critiques I would call critiques of the justifications. So critiques of the justifications. You can spell it with a K or whatever, I don't care. These are generally like, what I mean by justifications, I mean by the reasons that the act has provided for doing the plan. So these are often critiques of the advantages, essentially. So for example, if an affirmative read like an economy advantage, and they were like, our act is critical to maintain economic growth is good, blah, blah, blah. You could read a capitalism critique and say that the justification for the act relies upon the idea that economic growth is inherently productive. The affirmative uses that sort of assumption as a justification or a reason to do the plan, and that demonstrates some ways that the 1AC is sort of tied up in capitalist assumptions that are potentially problematic. So that is a critique of the justification provided by the plan, or an assumption provided by the plan, that economic growth is inherently productive. Another example is the critique that we all have in this packet, this borders/cosmopolitanism argument. This is basically an argument, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, hopefully. It says that the way that the topic approaches the issue of surveillance and explicitly separates domestic surveillance from other forms of surveillance kind of builds in a lot of assumptions about what domestic means. It builds in some assumptions about what a nation is, what citizenship is. It sort of inherently has the idea, if you say that we should restrict domestic surveillance, that there is a difference between the way that citizens of the United States or people that live domestically should be treated versus other people. So even though the 1AC doesn't explicitly say that, right, one of the sort of assumptions built into the 1AC is that there is a difference between our nation and the rest of the world, that domestic surveillance should be treated separately from other forms of surveillance. And there's a variety of potential problems with that in terms of the way that it sort of ingrains us in thinking about the world in nationalist terms or in terms of nations. So those are some examples of critiques of assumptions or critiques of justifications. Another category is critiques of representations or language. So some sort of classic examples of that include critiques of using gendered language. For example, using the term mankind to refer to all people. Or other sort of particular word or language choices. There's a variety of critiques that exist of particular terms. There's critiques of, for example, using like medical metaphors to talk about the military, using the term operations to talk about the military. There are critiques of that. It says that it sanitizes it, makes us think about it surgically. So there's a lot of different examples of critiques of particular words or particular language choices, the way that we choose to talk about the world and describe the world as being important. There's also a lot of critiques of the ways that we describe certain countries or regions. So for example, the Orientalism K contains a lot of arguments about describing the Middle East as a place that is inherently unstable or unpredictable, that sort of description of the world builds in a lot of racist assumptions about other people that are problematic. There's similar arguments for the way that we describe China, that we tend to constantly identify China as a threat, to describe them in the most hostile possible terms. That way of thinking about and describing the world is problematic. There's the gendered IRK of describing international relations purely in sort of materialist or objective terms with no consideration for social conditions. So those are all sort of different ways of, different sorts of critiques of language, critiques of the way that we describe and talk about the world. Do you have a question back there? Yeah, absolutely. That is the general idea. You want to pay attention to what sorts of words your opponent is using and how they are describing the world. And there are definitely a lot of potential critiques. So word critiques, ways that we describe regions, so like Orientalism, etc. Another common one that some of you all may have encountered is critique of using apocalyptic rhetoric. Right? So this is a critique that says that when we try and advocate action by saying, hey, if we don't do this, everyone's going to die, there's going to be extinction, the whole world's going to end, that sort of apocalyptic framing is potentially problematic, either because it incentivizes violence against people that we perceive to be disturbing that order, or because it creates passivity where people are so overwhelmed by extinction coming that they don't actually act very well. So there's a lot of different reasons why using apocalyptic justifications is a bad sort of rhetorical strategy or a bad use of language for describing the world. Yeah? Oh, critiques of describing regions, like Orientalism, which is what I was talking about before. Yeah, sure.
So, like, if the negative reads, like, say, politics DA, like, wouldn't they also be looking to something like apocalyptic rhetoric, or does it not matter if, like,
yeah. A lot of the time, the 1NC will contain inconsistent arguments in that regard, and that is certainly another source of things you could debate about. If you were AF, you could definitely say, hey, either they link to this critique as well, or if the negative can just say, we're not advocating those representations anymore, then the AF should be allowed to do the same. On the flip side, the neg could say, look, it's our position to test the AF from multiple angles. We don't have to be responsible for having one consistent position. We're allowed to contradict ourselves for the purposes of testing the AF more rigorously. So, that debate could play out either way. But theoretically, yeah, that'll be an issue. Either way, last kind of category that I would separate is critiques of the plan mechanism. So, not all critiques have to ignore the plan. There can be critiques that are critiques of the plan, or just like you deploy the military, that's militarist. Militarism is bad. And there are also just sort of more general critiques of using or relying upon the state for institutional reform as a strategy for addressing certain social ills. So there's kind of a wide variety, but a lot of them center around the idea that, there are critiques of relying upon the state or institutional mechanisms for. So some example, one big example that you may encounter on this year's topic is a critique that uses a bunch of work from this Italian dude, Giorgio Agamben. Yeah. I may talk about that a little bit more later, but it's kind of generally an argument that says relying upon the state to sort of grant rights or to grant protections still maintains the authority of the state or of sovereignty to decide who is included or excluded from a certain political order. So even if we have the state do something seemingly benign, like guarantee protections from surveillance, that still maintains the position of sovereignty, that if you do that, the state can still decide who is or is not protected, who does or does not get rights. And so that is a problematic strategy, that we should instead, as individuals, sort of create ways of existing that don't depend upon the state or on institutional organizations to grant us rights. Do you have another question back there? The Circle K is just my abbreviation for critique. A lot of people write critique in debate as this, deriving from the German. And so often people will just abbreviate critique as this. Saves you a lot of time flowing, so not a bad move. Anyway, any questions about those kind of categories of critiques? critiques of the justifications, critiques of the language, critiques of the plan strategy.
Is it possible to run these on the affirmative? Like, if you're going against the terrorist DA to say that, like, that's apocalyptic rhetoric?
Yeah, certainly. You can definitely, structurally there are some differences to doing some of this stuff on the affirmative, but in principle, yes, you can make most of these arguments on the affirmative as well. It would be tough to read the Agamben K on the aff, but, either way. Okay, so the next kind of section I want to talk about is going through some terms you should know. Critiques, in general, framework arguments often tend to focus the debate on issues that kind of go beyond the scope of implementing the plan. To start thinking about how we produce knowledge, how we think about the world, how we know what's true, how do we decide, those sort of questions. And so critiques and framework arguments in particular tend to raise kind of a lot of issues about where knowledge comes from and how we think about the world that bring up a bunch of fancy philosophical terms that are worth knowing. So, terms. First one, big one, epistemology. Epistemology is basically the study of knowledge. How do we know things? If I had to describe epistemology in one very brief, basic sentence, how do we know things? And how do we know that we know things? There are a lot of different schools of thought about how we know things, but sort of two big competing worldviews that capture a lot of the essence of the debate. Empiricism, you all might have often heard the term, this is empirically proven in debates. People are just talking about empiricism, looking at examples, looking at the past. Empiricism, generally the idea that all knowledge derives from sensory experience. Basically, the world is full of observable facts. The world is constituted by a bunch of observable realities that are largely objective. You'd be like, that chair is green, this table is white, United States hegemony deters great power conflicts. The world is full of objective, observable facts, for example, right? Constructivism, on the other hand, views that all of our knowledge is constructed in the sense that it is contingent on your perception and social experience. So constructivism holds that the world is not just a set of objective facts, that the world in fact looks different to every person based on the particular kind of social experience that they've had, the particular way that they choose to perceive the world, that the world is different based on our perception. And so the conclusion of that, or one implication of that, is that knowledge is relative. Relativism is the concept that points don't really have absolute truth, that things are only true sort of relative to subjective different perceptions. So different things can be true to different people. Empiricism, world is objective facts. Relativism or constructivism says that the world is a set of subjective perceptions. So a lot of the times in critique debates, the affirmative and the 1AC will make a variety of truth claims that they perceive to be objective. They will say things like economic decline causes war, hegemony solves conflict, proliferation makes conflict more likely. A variety of different claims that they perceive to be objective based on sort of our observation of the world and its objective facts. And critiques often sort of raise, hey, how do your assumptions about the world influence the way that you perceive it? So kind of a classic example comes with when I was talking about these critiques of the way that we describe different regions or countries. A lot of sort of security criticisms or threat construction criticisms. Make the argument that the way that we describe other countries as threats isn't objectively true, but it's kind of filtered through our assumptions about the world from the position of being the United States. And so, when we kind of see China, for example, sending some boats around the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands, if you are an offensive realist that tends to see the world as a bunch of states constantly competing for power, and you've made the assumption that all states just inherently want power, then it's very easy to look at that action and see confirmation. You're like, I see that as evidence that China is inherently aggressive. But that might not be objectively true. We don't know exactly why China is going into the Senkakus or not. The fact that we perceive that as an act of aggression sort of comes out of a lot of assumptions that we're making about the world and about the way that other countries operate based on the way we operate. But like, hey, if we sent a bunch of troops into this given place, we'd be doing it pretty aggressively, so we can only assume that China's doing the same thing. But that's not necessarily the case. That's building our assumptions about our perception of reality into our interpretation of other people. So those are kind of epistemological questions, epistemology. Second category of terms, ontology. Ontology deals with questions concerning what entities can be said to exist and how such entities can be said to exist. A lot of ontology arguments are deeply related to epistemology arguments. Ontology, like, what exists? How can we know what exists? How do we describe what exists? How do we categorize what exists? But, some examples of ontological issues that come up when we're talking about, like, politics or about government includes questions like, what is a government? What is the nature of a government? Is there really an entity such as a government that we can observe as being its own independent thing? Or is a government really just an amalgamation of smaller individual entities? So the question of like what exists, what entities exist, and how do we describe them? Should we say that there is an entity called government, or should we instead observe government as the amalgamation of a bunch of sort of individuals? That is an example of sort of an ontological question. How do we say what exists? How do we subdivide those entities? How do they relate to each other within some sort of hierarchy? So an example, I picked out this card that I like because I think it kind of describes this issue well in some language that comes up in debates. It says, ontological commitments logically precede substantive claims and provide the conditions of intelligibility for those claims. A claim such as democratic states do not go to war with one another implicitly makes a number of ontological presuppositions. The claim makes scientific ontological presuppositions that a state's democracy-ness is a conceptually acceptable attribute of that state, and also presupposes that a state standing as a democracy is something that is visible to external observers. So it's like a little bit dense sounding, but the basic idea is like, in order to make a claim like democracy solves war, we have to be able to say that democracy is sort of an observable, measurable characteristic. So that is an assumption that is an ontological assumption. Exists. Yeah. That's ontology. Honestly, a lot of times when people say ontology in debate, they're not really talking about ontology. So, but whatever. Pet peeves and stuff. Another term that you'll hear a lot, method or methodology. So this is one where like when people say this, they really mean two totally different things. Oftentimes, when people say method, they're really just kind of using a different term for an alternative. So they're just like, we have a method as a thing that you should do. Like our method is to be, critically self-reflexive about your history and how your history has created your identity. You should go through a process of, self-reflexiveness, self-consciousness or whatever. That is a method or a strategy. Like that is a good method for relating to the world. So that is one use of the term methodology that you hear a lot. A method is kind of another replacement for alternative. What should you do instead of the plan? You should follow this particular method. Another use of methodology that is important, though, is basically a way of analyzing the world. So, for example, we want to answer a question. We want to know, for example, does economic decline make war more likely? This is the question that I would like to answer. There are a variety of different methodologies that I could use to go about answering this question. I could use statistical analysis and hypothesis testing. So I could get a big database of like every country country, their level of economic growth in every year for the last 100 years, and whether or not they went to war. And I could do like a little correlation and do some math and be like, when people's economies go down, they're 7.8% more likely to go to war. That is one potential methodology. You could also, do case studies. So you could be like, I'm going to pick a particular example. Like I'm going to look at Europe during World War II, and I'm going to look at a bunch of depth and read about what different politicians were thinking at that time and what was happening in different states and kind of how these different things related. And I'm just going to do a sort of very narrow, in-depth case study on this particular issue. There's a lot of different potential other strategies, right? Those are just kind of two big examples in political science. But in general, a methodology is, a way of analyzing the world, or sort of the assumptions that are built into the way that you analyze the world. So in the borders critique that we have in our packet, there are some important methodology arguments relating to the idea of methodological nationalism. And so if you remember what I was describing, the premise of that borders argument, that it's sort of problematic to describe the world in terms of individual nations, as opposed to kind of a collective humanity. Dividing the world into nations is problematic. That implies some methodological arguments that when we go about analyzing the world, most political scientists, for example, the primary sort of unit of analysis, the primary thing that they observe or that they study is a nation. You look at most studies, how is it divided? You have each country by each year. You look at a country, you're like, all right, we're going to look at what happened in China. We're going to compare that to what happened in Russia. So methodologically, the way that people go about analyzing the world builds in the assumption that our description of the world should be based on nations. So that is an example of a sort of methodological argument, an argument that the affirmative's methodology is flawed. Last term I'll put here that you hear a bunch. You'll hear people talk about the role of the ballot or the role of the judge. This is really just a different way of saying framework. Right? Remember that the framework is, from what perspective should we evaluate the debate? Should we evaluate it from the perspective of a policymaker, deciding what policy action the federal government should take? Or should we evaluate it from the perspective of an individual thinking about how he or she contributes to particular ways of describing the world or particular ideologies? So when people talk about the role of the ballot or the role of the judge, they say, hey, the role of the ballot should be, us being critical intellectuals thinking about how we contribute to capitalism. They're just presenting a different framework. They're just presenting a different way of evaluating the debate. So those terms are basically always just different ways of saying framework, but somehow people like to say them anyway. Any questions about any of those terms? Mm-hmm.
What did you say under empiricism?
The world is objective facts. World equal objective facts. All right. So, plenty of things to talk about, so I'll keep going. So the next section, I was going to briefly go over a few critiques that you will probably run into on this topic. I'm really just going to talk about like 3. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list, because there are a lot of critiques that you'll see on every topic. Capitalism arguments, arguments about apocalyptic representations, stuff like that are pretty common. But these are a few that I just think are particularly relevant for this topic. So one that I already mentioned briefly is Agamben, different flavors of biopower critiques. I honestly am not a huge expert about this, so my description of this may be a little bit simple, but this is how I understand it. As I kind of described before, that part of the core of this argument is that the law always contains what Agamben refers to as a state of exception. So the state of exception is kind of like, basically think of a state of emergency where like, sort of all rule of law is off. We have to kind of suspend the law temporarily So think about like Guantanamo Bay during the war on terrorism. We're like, hey, war on terrorism, Al-Qaeda is a huge existential threat. I know that we have all of these rules about like due process and habeas corpus, but we're just going to suspend that for a little bit because we got to deal with terrorists. So his argument, though, is that the law always contains that that's not really the exception as much as it is the rule, because the fact that there is a sovereign entity like the government that has the ability to make decisions about who is or is not included within our political community means that there is always the potential to suspend the law for everyone or for particular groups. So that state of exception is something that is built into the law. The government can always take away any protections. And so this is often sort of read as a critique of affirmatives that depend upon the idea of rights, right? So like our act has a rights advantage. We're just like, people have a right to privacy and a right to communication. We need to have the government guarantee them this right. And Agamben would argue that those sort of provisions of rights are very flimsy protections, because the fact that the government is the one assigning you this right means that they still have the authority to take it away at any given time. What is the alternative to that then? And this is where it gets like a little bit messier, and my explanation might be a little bit off. But Agamben talks a lot about the idea of whatever beings. So we have the state of exception. Got whatever being. She describes as a being whose community is mediated not by any condition of belonging, right? So what I kind of mean by that, unpack that a little bit. If you are a citizen of the United States, right, you are a being whose community, the United States, your conditions of being part of that community, there are conditions to you being part of that community, right? Not everyone is part of this community. There are conditions. You are a citizen if you meet certain criteria, certain characteristics. There are sort of conditions that determine if you belong or not, right? So a whatever being would be, you know, someone who you just kind of create your own community that has no conditions of belonging, that are sort of outside the context of the state. Rather than making appeals to the state to give us particular rights, we should just create communities that don't have conditions of belonging. Is basically how I understand it. Which seems a little bit, you know, hippie utopia, but whatever. You got to take a shot somehow. So that's my super brief description of Agamben. That's horribly offensive to anyone who knows anything about Agamben. Anyway, number 2. I think this borders critique that we have. I think something along these lines is something that you may definitely see a fair amount of. Just like, why does the topic say domestic? The fact that we have chosen to talk explicitly about domestic surveillance as opposed to other forms of surveillance, that is a divide that is inherently built into the topic. The affirmative will always be exclusively domestic. They will always be giving protections, particularly to US citizens. And so, you know, that sort of critique is something that is built into the topic. It's almost guaranteed negative ground in that sense. I talked about it a little bit before, sort of brief summary. Because I don't have that much more time, I don't want to talk too much more about it, especially because, you know, this is the one that's in our packet, so I assume we'll talk about this more in our labs and whatnot. So I'll kind of move on from there for now. The last one I wanted to talk about is security K. And this one isn't, you know, doesn't initially jump out as being something that is super topic specific. You definitely see security critiques on any given topic. But for this particular topic, the sort of specific security critique evidence is really good. Just in the sense that there's a lot of people that talk about when we're trying to restrict the government or limit its powers to, you know, to engage in war, limit its powers to engage in surveillance, that the way we justify those restrictions is very important. If we say, for example, the government should not have the authority to do surveillance because that surveillance is undermining US soft power and US credibility in the world, which makes our allies less likely to support us, which undermines US hegemony. That is a very different argument than saying we should restrict the government's authority to engage in surveillance because the terrorist threat is constructed and government surveillance is a violation of people's privacy. The way that you justify those, even though they're both appeals to restrict surveillance, are very different. Because the appeal that is based on security justifications relies upon a lot of the same logic that justifies surveillance in the first place. You're like, all right, we're going to stop this one this instance of surveillance, but you're still maintaining the idea that it is legitimate for the US to identify security threats in the world and react to them as necessary, which is the foundational logic that justifies surveillance in the first place. And so there's kind of a lot of good evidence that says that when we use those sort of security justifications as the reasons why we should restrict government power, that government power ends up coming back and reproducing itself in more violent ways. So the security K is something that you will see on every topic, but I think there's a particular twist on this topic that is worth noting, just because it kind of interacts pretty well, and I think that you will interact with a fair amount of advantages that are based in sort of security arguments. People like getting to nuclear wars, to proliferation, to US hegemony. Those are impacts and things that people love to talk about. So, you know, people will read those kind of advantages. And you can kind of think about, if you debate an AF that doesn't have those kind of advantages, if you debate an AF that's just kind of like, rights are good, we should restrict surveillance because the government needs to respect our privacy, that doesn't really make security-based claims, then something like the Agamben critique is an interesting strategy. If you have someone who, you know, says we should restrict surveillance because it boosts soft power and makes US leadership better, then the Agamben K is less helpful because they're already making a bunch of sovereignty good arguments already, basically. They've already said that hegemony is good, that US leadership is good, so they have a bunch of arguments that sort of already clash with your critique. So in that instance, you could do something like the security K instead. So you could do like the security K against AFs with like right-wingy advantages, and like the Agamben K against AFs that are more soft left-wingy or whatever. All right. So I'm not going to get through both these last sections, but I should definitely talk about answering the K. Seems like a relevant thing to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes. That will be the next section. I generally think that there's kind of two kind of approaches to answering the K, and it kind of depends upon what sort of act you're reading. So the first approach, if you're reading sort of a more left-leaning kind of act, a little more liberal, a little more progressive, like rights are good, we should restrict the government because we need to preserve democracy, prevent tyranny, that sort of business. You have approach number one, which consists of a few parts. Permutation, attack their alt, and press on the link. The link-turning strategy, basically. So for example, you know, if you read an AF that's about protecting rights, we need to restrict the NSA to preserve people's liberties, protect privacy, etc. Someone reads something like the Agamben K, you want to be like, hey, look, we understand that sovereignty is problematic, that the state does violence, but our plan is a very pragmatic way of dealing with some of that violence, right? Remember from the topic lecture when Turner kind of talked about the idea that surveillance itself is a form of political violence, right? Like snooping around in people's lives and figuring out a bunch of stuff you're not supposed to know. That is a violation. It is itself a form of violence that is problematic. So yeah, the negative is saying that state violence is bad. You're saying, hey, our act is a way of limiting state power, of reducing state violence. So we're kind of in line with you. We're going the right way. The problem is generally, the critique is always going to go further than you. The critique is like more hippie than you are in these sort of instances. And so the sort of core of the AF strategy in this situation is to kind of emphasize the importance of pragmatism or of taking sort of incremental steps. Like, look, it's utopian to think that we can just create communities that don't have any conditions of belonging. We're not just going to get rid of the state. We're not just going to all be one part of one giant collective commune, right? Like, societies are going to exist, states are going to exist. You're being too utopian. Instead of trying to get rid of the whole thing, we should take pragmatic, incremental steps to reduce some instances of state violence, to put some restrictions on the state. So the sort of core part of that is you need to prove that their alternative is super utopian and impossible. If you don't do that, then this strategy almost never works because they just go further than you. All right? You're like, hey, we restrict the state. We prevent state violence. You're like, we do it better than you. So, tough luck. So unless you can defeat the alternative, you have to press on the alternative for this strategy to work. The permutation, hopefully some of you all have talked a little bit about counterplans at this point. Remember, a permutation is just arguing for the combination of the plan with some or all of the counterplan. With a critique, it's basically the same thing. Permutation is a combination of the plan with some or all of the alternative, right? So if you can win that your app is consistent with their critique, you're like, we're going in the same direction. We're both trying to restrict the state. We can combine our plan with your idea, right? Like, yes, we can aspire for this utopian community where we get rid of all conditions of belonging. We can aspire to that. We aspire to that as well, but in the short term, let's have this pragmatic restriction on the government. You can combine them. They can work together. So if you prove your strategies are consistent, then you can win the permutation, but you want to prove their strategy is unrealistic or utopian, and that you should sort of prefer pragmatic action. And then no link is just like, you want to kind of win that you're not the bad guys, right? You're like, look, we use the state, right, sure, we use the government, but we're using it in a negative way. We're using it to restrict its power. We have a negative state action is a term you'll hear a lot. The state is removing some authority that it has rather than positively granting some other authority. So that's kind of a general approach to think about answering the critique when you have sort of a left-leaning type affirmative. Let's say on the flip side that you just have a giant ass about why hegemony is good, right? Going for like permutation and no link is not going to be a winning strategy against a lot of critiques. You just kind of got to take them on. You just got to embrace your inner conservative and just kind of defend your position, right? And that's fine. That's a viable approach. I like taking this approach too because I just like clash. Just, if I know I'm saying the exact opposite of what you're saying, it's very easy. I know what I'm supposed to say. A lot of these, you're both kind of saying the same thing. You're competing to be a little bit better. I'm doing this just a little bit better than you. Just be like, all right, you're saying X, I'm saying not X. Do just the opposite. There's nothing wrong with this approach as well. If you're going to take this approach, there are kind of a few things you need to do. One that is in common with the first strategy, you still need to attack their alternative. Notice this is a common theme. You don't really want to get away with let the neg get away with just like winning that whatever utopia they describe just happens, right? Like most sort of negative alternatives envision a world with no violence where everyone sings Kumbaya and like you don't want to just concede that happens because you'll never win. Like you're not going to be better than that. So you have to win that their alternative won't happen. You have to win that there are some problems with implementing it, with getting there, that it's not realistic in the short term. So no matter what approach you're taking, you don't just want to spot them the alternative. Second thing that you need to do is defend your truth claims. And this is where all of these terms over here start to become super important. Because it's in these kind of debates where sort of questions of what is truth, what is true, how do we know what is true, become most important. When you're both disagreeing about very fundamental aspects of the world, when one person is saying that US hegemony is good, and one person is saying that sovereignty is always violent, you are disagreeing a lot about the world. And so questions of how we determine what is true, how do we know, how do we make predictions about the world, become sort of central questions. And so when you're defending your 1AC, you have to kind of win. Most critiques build in arguments that the threats that you identify in your 1AC aren't real. They're constructed, they're exaggerated, they're manipulated, the world's not all going to end. So when we were talking kind of about the security critique, about sort of threat construction, some of this stuff over here, this is an instance where a lot of those arguments come to play. And so in order to kind of defend that your impacts are true, you have to kind of defend a way of knowing the world in order to justify them. So if most critique arguments depend upon some concept of relativism or constructivism, that knowledge is something that is subjective, that is influenced by our perception, that is influenced by our social experience, then most of the time the affirmative wants to defend a position of empiricism, that the world is a set of objective facts that we can know. I did a study. I looked at all the countries in the world. I analyzed whether or not they went to war based on whether or not the world was unipolar or not, and I determined that war is less likely when there is a hegemon. That is an objective fact that I have identified. So in order to win that sort of argument, you have to defend that empiricism, or more particularly positivism, is the way that we should evaluate knowledge. And positivism, I guess I'll throw it over here. Is an idea that holds basically that every assertion can be scientifically verified or is capable of logical proof. Now, that's kind of what positivism was for a long time. More recently, verifiable is usually replaced with falsifiable. So rather than saying that every claim can be verified, most positivists, neo-positivists, you just put neo in front of everything, it becomes a new philosophy, that's how it works, would say that every claim is theoretically falsifiable. You could falsify it, right? So when you hear claims like, this is non-falsifiable, this is usually someone who's a positivist saying that whatever particular claim you're talking about is something that you couldn't measure to disprove, right? So, the way that this plays out, if I were to make a claim like economic decline leads to war, I could make a hypothesis. That's my hypothesis. I'm going to hypothesize that when a country's GDP goes down, their propensity for initiating a conflict goes up. I'm going to put all these numbers in a database. I'm going to run it, and I'm going to see whether or not that's true. I can either falsify it, prove that I was wrong, or not. It is a statement that can be falsified. A lot of claims that you'll hear when people are debating critiques are not sort of easily falsifiable, right? You kind of make a claim like, whoa, your assumptions that China is a threat is just derivative of your kind of application of your assumptions about realism to the rest of the world. All right, how do you falsify that statement? It's not something that is easily objective, easily made objective or falsified. So if you're affirmative, you almost always want to be defending a position of positivism, saying, hey, look, the world consists of objective facts. We should focus on the things that we can prove or disprove. We should focus on the things that can be falsified, not on some of these critical arguments that we can't falsify or not. So that sort of becomes an important epistemological and also methodological issue for kind of knowing that. And a big part of this, and of doing this well in debates against the critique, is to know stuff about your evidence, right? If you have a card that says, war in the South China Sea is likely, you should try and kind of go find this original article, read it a little bit more. Like, what sort of evidence is the author using to make this claim? Is it sort of a very detailed case study where this person is an expert in Chinese politics and has read a bunch of internal PLA documents? Or is this some dude writing in the Wall Street Journal? Like, knowing where your evidence comes from is important. And if you know a lot about your evidence and kind of what sort of claims your author uses, what sort of evidence they rely upon, then when you're defending your truth claims in a debate, you'll sound a whole lot better doing it, because you can be like, no, look, we can totally prove that this is true. This is the way that our author goes about doing it. They do this sort of study. They look at these sort of past examples. They really looked at this historical case. The more you can talk about that, the more credible these sort of arguments seem. Yeah, and the last part of this strategy is you have to defeat their impact. Win that the case outweighs. So I know in our lab, at least, we talked about if you're impact turning something, you always need to read impact defense as well, right? You can't just spot them their thing and then impact turn it. If you're like, economic decline is good, but you don't answer the claim that economic decline leads to war, you're in a lot of trouble. So if you want to kind of go with the strategy of just defending your truth claims, kind of being like, sovereignty is good, hegemony is good, we'll just take you up on all this, you need to make sure that you don't just let them win that, US hegemony makes extinction inevitable. You have to have impact defense against their claims as well. So you have to defend your truth claims, you have to defend your impacts, but you also have to reduce theirs, mitigate theirs, kind of put pressure. And this is a place where just in these debates, use cross X. Ask questions. Don't assume that the other team always knows what they're talking about. That's a good general rule for debate in general. Don't ever take the other team's words as gospel, because most of the time they don't know what they're talking about. But just ask questions. When people use sort of jargon or terms that you don't immediately understand, ask them to explain, ask them to elaborate. For two reasons. One, because you can't really answer the argument until you understand what it is. So if there's any confusion, if you don't know exactly what they're saying, you just need to ask for clarification. Don't feel stupid about that. Like, I don't know what half these terms mean a lot of the times. Like, there's a lot of complicated business that people spend their entire lives studying. You've been in debate for like a few years. Like, no one expects you to know everything about every philosophy. Feel free to ask questions. Make sure you know what's going on. And the second benefit is that oftentimes the other team won't really be able to explain what's going on because they're actually just kind of, blabbing out of their mouth. They don't really know what they're saying. And if that's the case, sometimes the judge will kind of pick up on that. The more that you ask, the more that you press for explanation, the more that their sort of thing will crumble in front of them. So use cross-X. Use it well. I feel like that's a good note to end, given that the next lecture is about cross-X.